This video is made possible by Morning Brew. Start your day by catching up on the top news in business, finance, and tech in 5 minutes by subscribing with the link down in the description. A few weeks ago, something incredibly unusual happened in the United States. This pipeline, which transports roughly half of all the oil consumed on the US East Coast, was the successful target of a cyber attack by a group of hackers in Russia. For nearly a week, the entire pipeline was shut down and the price of gas across dozens of US states skyrocketed to their highest prices seen in years, as their main supply source was cut off. People began hoarding gas in plastic bags. Flights were canceled or rescheduled, while the company that operates the pipeline agreed to pay a ransom of 75 bitcoins to the hackers in order to get everything back to normal again. It was all complete chaos. So let's go over how this all happened. Half a century ago, back in 1973, a similar event happened to Americans. That year, OPEC, an organization of mostly Middle Eastern oil-producing countries, decided to issue a complete oil embargo on the United States in response to American support for Israel. Within 5 months of the embargo beginning, the price of oil worldwide spiked by nearly 300%. And it got so bad in America that the US government began to introduce nationwide fuel rations. Gas stations stopped selling any gas on Sundays or Saturday evenings, while panic-induced hoard buying made the situation even worse. Eventually, 20% of all gas stations in the country ran completely out of fuel, and Americans were forced to endure hours-long lines every time they went up to fill up their cars for months. Around the time the embargo began, America was importing roughly 50% of the oil they were consuming from abroad. And after it ended, Richard Nixon made a promise to make the United States completely energy independent by the end of the decade, so that something like this would never happen again. Nixon's timing for American energy independence was a little optimistic, though. In reality, it took more than 40 years to finally accomplish. With the help of a booming fracking industry that accesses domestic shale oil and natural gas deposits, along with more heavy reliance on green energy sources, the United States is finally largely energy independent today, which has kept energy prices low both at home and abroad. But in a weird sort of twist, America's quest to become energy independent left some parts of the country vulnerable in other ways. Over the last few years, around half a dozen oil refineries across the US East Coast have had to shut down their activities because they couldn't keep competing with the more advanced refineries along the Gulf Coast region, which geographically benefit from their close proximity to the cheap and abundant oil and gas that's located across the state of Texas. In the 1960s, construction began on the Colonial Pipeline, the target of the cyber attack later on this year. The pipeline begins in Houston and transports oil and gas from Texas through 13 states to the Port of New York and New Jersey. And as more and more local refineries on the East Coast shut down, these states found themselves more and more reliant on the Colonial Pipeline for their oil and gas needs coming from Texas, which eventually made the Colonial Pipeline the single largest and most important pipeline in the entire United States. Today, the pipeline can carry 3 million barrels of fuel every day between Texas and New York, and roughly 45% of all the oil consumed on the US East Coast arrives through it. The East Coast's over-reliance on this single pipeline has caused problems before. When hurricanes have hit the Gulf Coast in the past and forced refineries there to close, it almost always causes gas prices on the East Coast to also increase. Normally, though, that's not a huge problem, because companies will store lots of extra fuel close by, and a hurricane's disruptive impact on the supply chain is always temporary. But the hack was much more disruptive than even a hurricane would have been, because nobody exactly knew how long it was going to keep the pipeline that provides for half the East Coast's fuel closed. It all started on the 6th of May, when the Russian hacking group calling itself DarkSide breached the Colonial Pipeline's servers and stole approximately 100 gigabytes of data. Initially, nobody noticed this actually happening, but on the following day, DarkSide initiated a massive malware attack on the Colonial Pipeline itself. The company that owns the pipeline freaked out, and as a precaution to contain the hack from spreading, They completely shut the entire pipeline down. The following day on the 8th, the Colonial Pipeline Company couldn't confirm when the pipeline would resume its normal delivery functions. Panic on the East Coast began to set in. Meanwhile, the hackers were blackmailing the company with the 100 gigabytes of data they had stolen from them a couple days ago. Unless the company paid up a ransom of 75 bitcoins, they would release all 100 gigabytes onto the internet. So, allegedly, within hours of the hack and the shutdown taking place, the company agreed to pay the ransom to the hackers in full. This was a controversial decision. Colonial's CEO would later go on to say in an interview that he made the call to pay the ransom because it was the right thing to do for the country. After making the Bitcoin payment, DarkSide sent over a decryption tool for them to get everything back online, but it proved to be brutally slow. By the end of the 9th, 2 days after the pipeline shut down, Colonial was saying that they planned to restore the pipeline's operations by the end of the week. But that hardly did anything to stop the panic that was now sweeping across the southeastern United States. In response to fuel shortages, American Airlines temporarily changed their flight schedules out of Charlotte, and many flights had fuel stops tacked onto their journeys, inconveniencing thousands of people. On the 9th, 3 days after the pipeline had shut down, President Joe Biden declared a national state of emergency that removed limitations on the transport of fuel by road. 4 days into the pipeline's shutdown on the 10th, fuel shortages at gas stations rapidly became apparent across Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina as panic buying really began to set in across these states. Nobody really knew if the pipeline was going to be opened up in a week or a month, which is why you have the goofy photos and videos of people buying up all the gas they could in trash bags and hoarding them inside of their cars. The area between northern South Carolina and southern Virginia was the hardest hit in the country. 71% of all the gas stations in the Charlotte metropolitan area were out of fuel by the 11th, just 4 days after the pipeline shut down. By the 14th, 87% of the gas stations in Washington, D.C. were also totally out. So as a result, average fuel prices in the United States skyrocketed to over $3 a gallon, their highest level seen in nearly 7 years since 2014. But the massive hoarding and panic buying made the situation much worse than it would have been otherwise. On the 12th, U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg even told people to stop putting gasoline into plastic bags.
I will say that this is a time to be sensible and to be safe. Of course, we understand the concern in the areas where people are encountering temporary supply disruptions, but hoarding does not make things better, and under no circumstances should gasoline ever be put into anything but a vehicle directly or an approved container.
But it was on this exact day later on at 5 p.m. that Colonial announced the restarting of the pipeline's operations, ending a 6-day total shutdown of the pipeline's activities. But it took several more days for operations to return fully back to normal. You see, oil and gas travels through the Colonial Pipeline very slowly, anywhere between 3 and 5 miles per hour. On average, this means that it takes fuel about 18.5 days to move from Houston to New York. By the 18th of May, 11 days after the shutdown and 6 days after the pipeline came back online, about 10,600 gas stations across the southeastern United States were still left without any fuel. In the end, it wasn't any kind of turmoil in the Middle East or inadequate American energy production which led to the week-long gas crisis. It was merely a small group of hackers and the collective panic of Americans themselves. DarkSide themselves even felt pretty bad about the whole thing. They released this public statement espousing their apolitical nature and that their goal was only to make some money, not to create any problems for society. A lot of what's happening today is based on what happened yesterday or last week. The fuel shortages in the Southeast are just now starting to end, and as a resident who lives in the Southeast, these events were directly impacting my daily life. I went to go fill up my car one day and was shocked to see that it cost me over $50, when it's usually hardly even $30. I wanted to understand why. And so I began keeping up with the events by reading the frequent short articles that were being posted to Morning Brew every morning. This is why I really love using Morning Brew. because their free daily newsletter gets you up to speed on the news you need to know in business, finance, and tech in just 5 minutes and in a way that's way more witty, relevant, and informative than traditional news is. For example, while I was writing this script that was inspired from their previous articles on the Colonial Pipeline hack, I also got to read about the plane that Belarus's dictator forced to land in order to arrest a journalist on board, the ongoing trial between Epic Games and Apple, and the surging air travel anticipating the European Union's reopening announcement. Since you watch RealLifeLore, I know that you like getting a bit smarter and staying better informed, and regular, repeatable patterns of learning are exactly the best way to do that. So go ahead and start your mornings with Morning Brew by subscribing completely for free when using the link down below in the description. It's one of the best ways you can help support this channel for free, and you get to stay up to date with fantastic articles on current events. It's seriously a win-win, and as always, thank you so much for watching.